Welcome to another episode of the Business of Speed podcast. I'm Steve Breitenstein here with Nick Bratton. This is our official first two-man podcast of 2024. We started the year off with Jesse Wright, providing a great kickoff with his journey in strength and conditioning and how it's led him to this space of mentoring younger coaches. And Nick and I want to take advantage of this early year show to kind of touch on some of the things that are going on in the facilities we're at, and the big picture items about what are we trying to have happen this year on a big scale. And then maybe pulling it back a little bit to some of the smaller items that we have to get done along the way. And it's that rhyme and reason to the ebb and flow of the private side. And you have your feast and famine months. Right now, I was talking to some newer coaches that are kind of on board with our facility. And I told them it's going to feel extremely overwhelming between now and March with how the facility runs in the Midwest Chicagoland area. We're jammed up with athletes, but come March, all the spring sports go outside, and then we get to regroup and really do some work on the business. Nick, for you guys, are you in a similar position of where you're kind of feasting right now, and then you'll have a little bit of a breath come that springtime?
It's interesting, and I know that we're going to talk about this quite a bit today on the episode, but normally, yes. Normally, this is a very busy time of the year for us. I mean, almost a second to summer. We've now sent all of our college athletes off. We've got a couple of pro baseball guys who are still working with us before spring training. We have a few baseball players that are in. But yeah, this tends to be a busier time before it slows down because all of our baseball and lacrosse go into season. However, I am predicting that is going to change drastically this year. And I don't know how quickly we want to talk about this, but we are seeing a massive uptick in our volleyball players. So much so that we have probably tripled the number of volleyball players that we are seeing currently compared to where we were last year. And even last year was not a small number. Even last year, I think we had 30 or 40. But for example, this weekend we have a tournament here in town, which really kicks off the indoor club season. And between the indoor tournament here in town and a beach tournament that's going on in Tampa, we have almost 100 athletes competing.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so, one of the things that I've told our staff is be prepared for the fact that normally February, March, April is a very slow time for us because we lose a lot of our baseball players. This year, that's not going to happen. We'll lose our baseball players, and that will quickly be followed by a large group of volleyball players. And Steve, you've probably seen this before too. When we start to see a lot of very high level high school girls come in and they start to get on the story and they start to share their results and we start to post about them, then the middle school players start to follow suit. Yeah. And so, I foresee that's what's going to end up happening to us here over the next couple of months is we're going to have a very, very large influx of volleyball athletes.
Yeah. And I think later on, we're going to dive into kind of how that happened and the intentionality of pushing that further as the business continues to evolve and grow. For what's going on in the facility right now, I know that you had some volleyball coming in. For us, and I know similarly for you, we have a lot of track athletes that they are weeks away from starting to compete. And on the speed side, they do offer one of the most unique coaching opportunities that we have all year long, especially when we're talking about block starts and some different special sprint exercises and different training methodologies that we might be able to do with them. For you, Nick, you are a former track athlete. You've organized track clubs before. Where are you on this perspective of kind of how much time do you want to spend in blocks with your athletes in this preparation piece? Are you waiting for a certain year in high school, or do you get them going right as freshmen? Do you guys work blocks early off season, only late off season? How do you feel about blocks?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, like most questions in this field, the answer is
it depends. Don't you dare say it. Don't say it. Oh, man. I knew it was coming.
And here's why. The blocks are a very uncomfortable position to get into, and they're a very tedious thing to work. And so, if I have somebody that is just reluctant to do it, I'll never do it with them. I had a girl last year who was running track for only the second time ever as a junior in high school. and she ran the 100 and 200, and she had no desire to get in blocks. And I tried to force her for a couple of weeks, and I never got what I really needed out of her. And we got to the point where it's like, listen, let's just go standing start. You're going to be one of the only people doing a standing start. But if that's where you're comfortable, then that's what you need to do. And she ended up having a great season. But I can tell you that if she would have had to get on the start line in those blocks, she mentally would have checked herself out. Yeah. And so for that reason alone, I allow the athletes to kind of tell me when they want to start. I usually do not teach anybody younger than 8th grade or 14 years old how to get into blocks, just because they're not needed. And in most middle school meets, you're not going to see blocks around the track. They're not available to you. But I will say, I had a girl, seventh grade, 13 years old, show up this year. And she loves sprinting. Has been running track for a long, long time. And just absolutely loves it, but has never been taught how to get into blocks. And because she was so passionate about it and so excited about it, I want to use that excitement, because let's be honest, at the end of the day, if we don't show them how to do it, they're going to go and do it on their own. It's the same with weightlifting. It's the same with, our plyometric work. If these kids have interest in these things and we don't facilitate that, then they're going to find a way to feed that desire on their own. And so why not give them a little bit of coaching? Why not help them out a little bit? So that's kind of my feeling on when is the appropriate time to teach. But I think we would be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about physically what we need to see to be able to get into blocks. And, a couple of things that I want to see and that I am really looking for is that, one, these athletes first understand true sprinting mechanics. If you haven't been through true acceleration progressions, if they don't know how to control themselves through the first 20 or 30 meters of that acceleration, then it's fruitless. And also, before we ever get in the blocks, we'll go through our entire acceleration progression and then work into top of push-up starts, 3-point starts, 4 points without the blocks, and then get to the blocks. Because once you put something under their feet, then it just changes the entire feel of it and what where your focus is. And so, because of that, I want to make sure that, again, they've been through all the acceleration work. And then from a strength standpoint, we're doing a lot of good unilateral strength-based work. So that, again, they do have a good comfort level of being in this deep knee and hip bend position on one leg and trying to produce enough force to drive themselves out. So, there are several things that I look for, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but those are two of the big pieces right there. Is just the acceleration progression and good unilateral strength.
Yeah. The thing that you just said that stuck out so much to me, Nick, is that mentally they're willing to do it and want to do it. I think that that's a piece that we kind of underestimate the importance of. They are going to probably have to do them in their high school practice. Right. And that's where a lot of the athletes that I've been spending some time with, just to give them individual attention for their blocks, they tell me that they have to do blocks, but they do like 5 or 6 in practice. Mm-hmm. And that's all they have time for, because fair to the track coaches, they might have 100 athletes at their practice. They can't organize it really well enough if there's not enough coaches to support it, to have people come out of the blocks and being coached every single step. And so at this point, it always feels like they love the eyes and even some video to see what it looks like when they're coming out. Yeah. But the frustration that is endless is we do a lot of blocks through our timers, because we time with a 5-yard head start without blocks. Really easy to set that up and then do it with blocks. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning, they are always way slower, always slower than when they stand up. And they get super frustrated at first. And they're like, why are we even doing this? I said, well, if you are going to come out of blocks at your meets, then we have to spend some time doing this. If you choose not to go at your meets, then we won't do it. But you can't just wildly expect to show up at the meet and then be good at coming out of the blocks. Yeah. Now, after we work that, maybe even for a couple of years, they come out dramatically faster from the blocks than they normally would standing up. But I think there is that mental piece to it at first, where it's not particularly enjoyable because you are running slower, because it's awkward coming out. You rise too early, you rise too slow. You like, there's all these small intricacies of those first 3 steps that will ruin the rest of your acceleration. And the value isn't always there just to look cool coming out of the blocks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think too that um, when it's done in the high school setting, because I've been a high school track coach before, and I understand what it is when you have 40 athletes that are trying to do block starts. You only have 4 or 5 sets of blocks. You're coaching the gross movement mechanics, and I understand that.
Mhm.
And so, a lot of times, similar to your athletes, our athletes will go and they'll get some reps there, but they're going to look for the technical work with us.
Yeah.
And that's where, too, like when our athletes are coming in, they're coming in after track practice. And for example, I had a track athlete last night. She came in after running 6 200s. I mean, that we can talk about workouts at a different date.
Yeah.
But as a 60-meter runner, she was toast. And so the fly 10s that I had programmed weren't going to work. The wicket runs that I had programmed weren't going to work. None of this highly neural work was going to help. And so it's a great day for us to get into blocks. Let's work something that's a little more technical where we can just focus on one aspect of it. So for her last night, one of the things that we focused on was a toe drag out of the blocks. And again, we can talk different strategies and block starts later, but we're just going to take one piece of the start and we're just going to focus on that. It's not that we're trying to clean up the entire thing itself, but let's just clean up one piece of it. And that's where, again, as opposed to other sports where they're working on skill development, they're working on strategy, they're working on plays, or they're working on all kinds of different things. Track is one thing. It's just running. And so like if you ran at school, you're probably not going to be able to do as much running with us. And so that's where we do have to break it down into more of the technical work when we do get them after some heavier volume or heavier intensity practices.
Without a doubt. Similarly, I recently had a track athlete that worked out on a Saturday at 10 a.m. to 11:30 in one of our groups. Speed, jumping, different plyo med ball work. And then told me, hey, I need to work blocks. Can I come back at 1 for the track specific group? And I said, well, yeah, do not run during that group though. Specifically, you're going to be coming and just doing block work. And sure enough, that's what he did. He came back at 1, he had gotten lunch, and we just worked blocks. That's all he did. No further than like 12 meters out. That was as far as he came out of them. But we just did about 40 minutes of block work. With plenty of rest. When I say 40 minutes, everybody, if you're listening, calm down. It wasn't that he did like 50 reps in 40 minutes. He maybe got like 10, 12 reps in that amount of time. But that was super valuable for him because it just like what you said, it just doesn't feel like he gets the reps in practice.
Yeah.
I know you said like it's kind of wait on specific technique for a different day, which I'm excited to hear that day. But a recent thing that came my way was the old adage of how do you space your blocks? And I know there is a bit of it depends, but there is a formal coaching style that's gone back for years, which is the 2-3 setup. And I saw Boo Schexnayder speak, and he said, when I have a brand new athlete who's never used blocks before, I have them do 2-3. And when I have a good high school athlete, I have them do 2-3. And then when they come to LSU and they start working with me, I have them do 2-3. And then when they go to the Olympic trials, I encourage them to do 2 and 3. And so it was kind of that foundation of if you're doing 2 and 3, you're getting a pretty solid setup. Then I heard our coach recently that because that's what we talk about around the facility for our younger staff that maybe is not as track fluid with their language or just the setups, we always kind of encourage just go with 2-3 when you're helping a track athlete. It's just a great foundation. They went to a clinic and saw someone speak, and they're like, if you're doing 2-3, you are ruining your athletes. It is a terrible way to do it. And so they texted me immediately like, hey, just so you know, so-and-so said this about the 2-3 setup. And I said, well, that's very interesting. I know who that coach is, and that's interesting they said that. But I still believe it does provide a great guideline for an early setup that then you can make subtle adjustments from there based on leg length and arm length and everything like that. But for you, Nick, when you're doing a very entry-level setup, what do you go with?
That's funny. I haven't heard that before. So yes, I would agree. I start everybody at a 2-3. And then you make subtle adjustments from there. There are not a lot of things that I align with Boo on, but one thing that I do align with Boo on is block starts. There aren't many high school athletes that need anything different than a basic 2-3 setup. However, a couple of things to take into account. One, ankle mobility. There are a lot of athletes that cannot get into a good block position and get good contact on the block, a full fore and midfoot contact on the block, because they're really, really stiff in their ankles, especially volleyball and basketball players coming out, and even some football players who tape their ankles. So that's one thing to take into account. Other athletes that tend to be really long athletes that aren't necessarily strong enough. So, for example, I was talking to you about the 13-year-old girl who really wanted to get into block. She's 13 years old and she's 6'1". So she hit, she's a former gymnast. She basically had to quit gymnastics because she was so long. Yeah. But she's a former gymnast. So she has really good strength. And so because of that, because she is so long, she's not someone that I like to have too far away from the line, because her feet are so large. I mean, when you go 2-3 on her, she is reaching to try and get up to the line. So she's someone that I'm going to have crowd the line a little bit. And so, her first foot is really about 1.5 to 1 3/4 off the line. The second foot is really only about 2.5 feet off the line. And so again, part of it is based on like their lengths as well. The other thing that I look at is when we get in the set position, and that's really what we need to base it off of, is when you get in the set position, how does everything line up? So before we ever rise up, I'm making sure that shoulders are about 2 inches in front of the hands. When we come up into the set position, I'm making sure that the hips are 2 to 3 inches above the shoulders. And then I let the rest of the body tell the story. And so on the front shin, on the back shin, are we about parallel with the ground? When we come up in that set position, how much contact is our foot making on the block? What does the thigh separation look like? Do we look like we have at least 20, 25 degrees of separation in that start position? And so, coming up into that start and getting a better idea of, okay, is this where we really want to be? Or do we need to make some adjustments from here based on how this is going to impact that initial step?
I love that. And I think I don't want to spend all the time on this because
Sure.
I love it. I think it's so interesting. And as a non-track athlete background, I love hearing track coaches talk about setups and the different things because I just find it so fun as a new stimulus. But I would love to, Nick, on the next episode, if we can talk about specifics on that setup like you just did, and maybe even make a little post about that. And then kind of going through the checklist of what our athletes should be doing as they're setting up. Because there's aspects of breathing. There's aspects of where do you want your weight in your hands and your feet. There's all these things that they can just check off to create a great pattern for every time they line up to race, where sometimes they just get in the blocks and then just go.
Yeah.
And that intentionality, it's similar when we have our guys do their 40-yard dash for the combine, is you got to have this checklist that you go through, finishing with however you're going to take that last breath. On the 40-yard dash, you cock the hand back, count to 1, and then you go. But there's a checklist that the athletes go through every single time to make it very robotic and repeatable. And the same thing happens when you're in those blocks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. And, I even think one of the things that we could also discuss and maybe a post that we put up too is something about, projection angles. Because as we talk about this acceleration progression and we talk about block starts, one of the things that I think has become a little bit popular because of Les Spellman is the importance of projection. And track coaches have known this forever. Most sports performance coaches have known this for a long time. But understanding projection angle, how different starting positions get you there. And honestly, that's what we're talking about in the blocks. When we're talking about the angle of the pedal, when we're talking about the distance off the start line, you are talking about projection angles and your ability to control those angles and to control your body positions in order to accelerate efficiently. And so, I think that's great. I'd love to go further on that.
Oh, that's awesome. And as you talked about earlier in the podcast, there is this piece where different athletes start coming through your facilities. For us, early on, we didn't have a ton of track athletes. And then we started to have a track club, which seemed to align really well with what we were trying to do. But how it aligned was because we started making this shift in our niche. And this is where we want to actually spend some time talking about that. Sometimes these shifts start to happen unintentionally, and then you can choose to either roll with them or fight them. Or you're really thinking about them on the front end to say, here's what I'd love to be doing and working with and who I want to be working with. For us to share at TC Boost how this niche came about was when our owner first started TC Boost. It was one of the only facilities around. We're talking about 22 years ago. And so it was a one-stop shop. There were people that didn't lift at their high schools that would do lifting. A lot of lifting got done. There were people that didn't have any exposure to speed and agility. So we did a lot of speed and agility. So it really was a sport performance facility at the beginning. Over the course of the years, though, it became way more popular. We started having 4 or 5 sport performance facilities within a 5-mile radius. You started having dozens of personal trainers that were offering strength training and quote unquote sports performance training. We know what that often tends to look like. And then the last thing was that we were struggling to program as we evolved the type of facility we wanted to keep up with that, because our design was 75% turf, 25% weight room. But then we were still trying to keep up with, we're going to lift. And it just wasn't happening at the level that we wanted to. And so we had conversations intentionally to say, what if we double down and just say that we are a speed training facility? That's what we're going to market to. That's how we sell ourselves. We always say that we can lift to support our speed development. But number one, we're a speed facility. We want to add value to the high schools that are already lifting at a high level. We're not really promoting that we do weight training. And that's what we decided to do. And over the course of the years, it has changed dramatically the type of athlete that comes through the facility. A huge influx in track and field. A lot of female athletes start coming through because they're not looking for a lift first facility. They want to get faster. They'll lift if we ask them to, but they came to us because it's a little different feel. We started having unique groups of basketball. Field hockey all of a sudden starts coming through. And we've really started to roll with that, as now the facility is known as the speed facility. We go other places to do our strength work sometimes, but we come here to do speed. And have you seen a similar story take place for you guys at BSP, Nick? Because you've had your hands in all kinds of different things where you were track and field, only speed, then going to lifting, then being like, there's different iterations of this business plan. And where do you see it kind of going, as you hinted earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I first opened BSP back in 2016, this is after I had transitioned down from Indianapolis. I had just spent a couple of years with the Pelicans. And so, in Indy, I had a massive track group. I mean, we had 70 or 80 people every single year. We were always sending off at least a dozen, if not 2 dozen, college committed athletes to compete at the next level. And so, we had a very, very successful track club. And so, I had opened this facility with the intent on, I'm coming from basketball. I'm going to continue to do basketball, because at that point, as I knew I was phasing out of the NBA, I had started working with some high level basketball athletes in the area. And I had said to myself, okay, I had a very successful track club before. I'm going to start another very successful track club. And because of that, I picked the building based on the length that I had. I picked the building that was the longest, 125 feet. So I had enough room to do our speed work in there. And I also put in, flooring that was way more expensive than I probably should have for a startup. I mean, in our startup costs, our Mondo track was half of the startup cost. But I was that dialed in on track. Then we opened the facility up, and there aren't a ton of basketball players that want to train. The ones that do want to train have school ball, and then they have AAU, and then they have their shooting coach. So they have less availability. And most track athletes in the South play another sport. They play basketball, they play football, they're doing something else. There are very, very few track specific athletes, at least in the New Orleans area. And so it really blew my business out of the water. I was not prepared for that. And so we did have, some basketball players, some track athletes coming in, and we were surviving. But really what kicked us off was we had a baseball player come in, 14 years old. He ran a 7.160. And he's like, can you get me under 6? Well, within 18 months, he ran a 6.44. And this was one of the fastest 60s that I can't remember the group that was running it, that was running the showcase, but they're a national brand, and it was one of the fastest that they had all year. And because of that, our baseball following blew up, and we had baseball guys coming from all over the place. Now our niche was still speed, but it was speed for another group, and so at that point, everything became baseball focused. We still worked with our basketball athletes, we still had our track athletes, but we were very, very focused on training the baseball player. To this day, we still train a ton of baseball guys, but we are starting to see this shift. And we talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the podcast. We are seeing this shift now in the business. We, are still extremely busy throughout the summer, throughout the fall, baseball guys coming in, but we had a couple of volleyball girls last year who had just standout seasons. And for most people who don't train volleyball athletes, for the female volleyball player, if you can touch 10 feet, that's kind of like the holy grail. That's like if you're trying to get recruited and you can touch 10 feet on an approach, like you've got a really good chance. Well, we had, I think last fall, we had 4 girls touch 10 feet, who previously were not at 9'9". And so, we saw that, and we did a very good job of getting that out on social media, making sure everybody knew about it, making sure people saw them constantly. And because of that, those 4 girls brought their entire high school teams in. Then all of those high school girls who all play for different clubs then brought all the club teams in. And so now we are seeing a massive upswell in volleyball players that are coming in. And to be perfectly honest, I have found over a decade of coaching, I work better with female athletes. My personality just fits better with them. I'm not good at stroking people's ego. I'm not good at programming ego lifts. I don't like most of the guys that come in, we don't fit well with. All of the athletes that I've thrown out of the facility tend to be boys that are just, goofing off. But I do like how bought in a lot of our female athletes get. They want to understand the why. They want to understand the entire training process. They want help with, recruiting and all of these other aspects. And they're so holistic with it. And so, and this isn't to say that we're not working with any of these other groups, baseball, track, basketball, things like that. But we're just seeing that, volleyball is starting to take over and become, our dominant sport within the facility. And so, one of the things that I think sports performance facilities, facility owners hopefully realize, I hope that they get to this point, is you don't always choose your niche. Sometimes the niche just chooses you. And I think for the most part, like our niche has always been speed. And as you know, one of the offsets of that is jumping too. Typically if you're pretty fast, you can jump pretty high. And if you can jump pretty high, you're pretty fast. And so by being able to train either of those, we've been able to aid the other. And so because of that, we have pretty incredible vertical numbers, and it's really changed, what our business looks like.
I think that's awesome. What you touched on right there is like when you start out in this field, it's okay to pursue something. They don't just come into it and be like, well, I'm just open to whoever comes my way. You can start by pursuing people for sure. Like to say, I want to work with basketball athletes and do your best to bring in basketball athletes. But early on, you are in that place where you got to pay the bills. And so oftentimes while you're pursuing, let's say, basketball players, you're going to have some adults that come along that are helping you pay bills. You're going to have some soccer players that are helping you pay bills. In the end, you might still want to pursue basketball, but you're going to work with those athletes early. And what happens is by doing a great job along the way and serving them well and be professional, you never know where the niche is going to take you. And in the end, you're now at a place where now you can be a little bit pickier. You can choose who you're spending more time with. And I know this is something that took several years to get to, where it was, man, I'm working with anybody all day long. For me as a coach, I'm not the owner, remember this, as a coach at the facility. Early on, I would have a mix of 8 to 80-year-olds throughout the day. Now, as I am 12 years in, I have a mix of the athletes that really I want to work with. I have a lot of field hockey female athletes that I'm working with right now. Never thought that was going to be the case. During the late summer, I had a lot of male basketball guys that I intentionally created a group, and then I was able to allocate 3 hours a week for that group. So your niche is always evolving. And as you do a great job as a coach and marketing yourself and getting good results from your athletes that you're able to share, in the end, you'll be able to decipher what niche you really want. But it's still okay to start out with something you're pursuing. Like Nick said, he came down from Indianapolis with track to work in the NBA, moving from NBA, thinking maybe I'll be back in track. But things have a different way of working out. But he still was actively pursuing that one when it started.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the other thing that you hit on, and I think, I don't know how much of our listening audience deals in the private sector, and I don't know how much is in high school. But I would say for those of you that are in the private sector, the longer that you spend in it, especially if you're good at what you do, you get to the point where you can start to cater to who you want to work with. As Steve was talking about, early on, you take anybody who's got money. I remember those days, and we would take the youngest athletes. We would take people who I knew weren't going to be consistent, people who were a pain in the neck. I was telling my wife the other day, there was a point where I almost shut down our 6 a.m.s because of the number of times that I showed up at 6 a.m. that nobody else showed up, that people were on the schedule and they would not come in. I'm working 70, 80 hours a week, and I am just exhausted, but I'm still showing up even though I know they're not going to come in. And now we get to this point, it's like we can decide who we want to work with, when we want to work with them, and how often. And it's nice to be able to get to that point. But again, you develop your niche, you develop your preferred clientele based on your ability to provide a service, to be able to provide what you say that you're able to provide, to do it consistently, and to do a really, really great job.
Yeah. And as your niche evolves, I think the truly great coaches in our field evolve with that and dive into it. As we were just talking about jump training, we had recently on the podcast, Tyler Ray. And, okay, I feel like I'm getting more basketball players and I'm getting more volleyball players. Let me dive into somebody like Tyler Ray and get even more tidbits about approach jumping from him and see if I can be even better for these athletes that I have coming in. That's how I felt when I started having more track athletes coming my way. Again, I was not a track athlete by my nature. It's not what I did in high school or college. And so when I started having these athletes want to work with me, I understood basic speed, but I didn't necessarily understand what was necessary to be a great track athlete. And I started out asking the guys around me. Then I started going to the Track and Cross Country Coaches Association clinics, where I was the only non-track coach there, I believe, for like 3 years. I didn't see another person that wasn't actually a track coach there. And I just ate it up. I loved it. And then practicing on myself and then working that in with my athletes. But it's because I wanted to be good and great for my athletes. If I was going to have this niche that I felt was happening and I wanted to lean into it, I needed to become even better for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. So for the next episode that Nick and I bring your way, we want to dive a little bit deeper into the idea of sprinting for track athletes, coming out of blocks, putting a little bit more of a deep dive. We're probably here in Chicagoland. We're essentially maybe 4 weeks, 5 weeks out from the start of like the indoor really getting intense. I know you guys have a little bit different season to your track, right?
Yeah, so we're in really the meat of indoor season. We will compete indoor state first week of February, outdoor will begin last week of February.
Love it. So we'll be making a couple posts about that. Any coaches that are in similar places with the season that they're working through, check that out and look forward to bringing you guys more content that's valuable to you.